crime stories are often shocking. However, none are more shocking than the case that rocked the hills of Tennessee. That's the case of desperation and murder, the sad story of Kate McCormick. Here's the story. Kate McCormick was a beautiful 21-year-old woman who lived in Humboldt, Tennessee in the year 1874. Now, Katie was always known as a carefree child, and she carried that special quality with her as she blossomed into one of the most beautiful women in town. And also, it wasn't uncommon for Kate's father to have friends over, as her family was quite respected in town, and it was also common for some of the men in town to find their way to the home at some time or another. George Burgess, who had his own business as a shoemaker, was often seen around the home. He had known Katie her entire life. However, now that Kate had turned from a child into a beautiful young lady, Burgess began to notice Kate's beauty, and his friendship with her father notwithstanding, he approached Katie one evening while Kate's father was out of the room and proposed his sexual desires for her. Later that evening, he would have a sexual affair with his best friend's daughter. Kate looked at the night of her sexual encounter with her father's best friend as something she was glad that was over. Burgess had told Kate that he had fallen in love with her and intended to marry her and give her a comfortable life. It seemed that the main goal for most ladies in 1874 was to find a good husband and start a family. Now, many times this was a decision that was made out of common sense rather than one from any sort of love. So while Kate had no sexual attraction towards Burgess whatsoever, he could offer her a good life. So she gave in to his pleas that night. It was the biggest mistake of her life. However, Kate wasn't the only one that regretted that night. Once Burgess got what he wanted, he began to avoid her, and the comfortable life that he promised her somehow floated away. Kate was ashamed of the situation, but it wasn't until a few months later, when she learned that she was pregnant, that her life took a tailspin that she would never recover from. Kate ran to Burgess and told him of their expected child, but Burgess refused to follow through with his promise of marriage and sent her on her way. Now keep in mind that in 1874, a woman who was pregnant outside of wedlock had just committed social suicide. She would often be shunned by the townspeople, and finding a husband was nearly impossible, as no one wanted to marry the woman who had been labeled by the town as shameful. Now, Kate mustered up the courage to tell her mother of her condition, but she would find no support there, and her parents actually disowned her and threw her out of the house. No one in town would speak to her, and instead only gave her side glances of judgment. It was just too much for her to bear, and she packed her belongings and ran off to live in Memphis, Tennessee, where nobody knew her. While in Memphis, Kate had reached the end of her rope. She was alone and scared, and she decided to do the unthinkable. She went to see a Dr. Johnson and asked him to abort the baby, with the hopes of her life reassuming some sort of normalcy. However, Dr. Johnson refused to do the abortion and advised Kate that not only was the abortion illegal, but also immoral, and she should go on her way. However, Kate pulled out a wad of cash from her purse that was her life savings and handed it to the doctor. Dr. Johnson slid the money in his pocket as he turned to grab a bottle of pills and handed them to Kate. He told her that if the pills worked, she would miscarry in 6 days. As the months went by, Kate assumed the pills had not worked, as she was still very much pregnant. 3 weeks before Christmas, 1874, Kate rented a room in a boarding house and prepared herself to give birth. Now, Mrs. Woodrig was not only the landlord of the boarding house, but she was also an excellent midwife and agreed to help Kate through the birth of her child. That evening, Kate went into labor, and when the baby was born, Mrs. Woodrig's face went blank and told Kate all she needed to know. The baby that was born was dead. However, due to complications from birth, Kate was not doing well either, and without the ability to afford a doctor's care, She died there in her room a few hours after giving birth. However, before she died, Kate had told Mrs. Woodrig the whole story of what happened to her, and that she paid Dr. Johnson for the pills for the abortion. Mrs. Woodrig went to the authorities, and Dr. Johnson was arrested for the murder and the death of Kate's baby. And Mrs. Woodrig contacted Kate's parents and notified them that their daughter had died during childbirth, but they refused to pay for the burial and demanded that Kate's body not be returned home, but instead find some place to bury her in Memphis somewhere. For the next 100 years, Kate was buried in an unmarked grave in the far corner of the Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee. However, in 1997, the story of Kate McCormick would be found in a story in an old newspaper, and the reader just couldn't bear and had mercy and purchased a gravestone that tells the sad tale of the life of Kate McCormick.